In the summer of 1883, a giant rancher in Wyoming territory warned the small Japanese woman he had sent for that she couldn't survive this country, and she whispered back a reply he would remember for the rest of his life. Nash Garrity had built his ranch with his bare hands and his reputation on his size, and he had never met a man or a beast that couldn't be settled with either one. When Haruko stepped off the supply wagon in a kimono the color of dried plums, jet black hair pinned in a traditional knot, he saw someone who wouldn't last a week. He told her so, plainly, the way he said everything. She looked up at him with those dark, steady eyes and answered so quietly that he had to lean down to hear her. Stay until the end to see how a woman trained in the old ways of Japan humbled a giant and scattered a gang of outlaws without raising her voice. Hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The Garrity Ranch sat 20 miles from the nearest town, a spread of grass and rock and weather-beaten fence that covered more ground than some counties back east. Nash had carved it out of nothing over 6 years, fencing the perimeter himself, building the house from cottonwood logs he cut and dragged one at a time. The work had made him strong, and the solitude had made him silent. And by the time he thought to send for a bride, he had forgotten how to be anything else. He stood on the porch when the wagon rolled in, leaning against the post with his arms crossed. The driver, Tucker, who ran supplies from Red Fork twice a month, jumped down and began unhitching the team without looking up. The porch sagged under Nash's weight, the way every surface did, because a man who stood 6'7" and carried 300 pounds on a frame made of bone and gristle left marks on everything he touched. Haruko climbed down from the wagon bed on her own, her small leather case clutched against her ribs. The kimono she wore was a deep plum color, the silk dulled by weeks of travel, but still unmistakably refined against the dust and sage of the Wyoming yard. Her jet-black hair was pinned in a traditional knot, and her almond-shaped dark eyes took in the ranch with a single, unhurried sweep. She was small, thin in a way that spoke of the long journey rather than any natural delicacy, her fair skin drawn tight over high cheekbones that caught the late afternoon light. Nash walked down the porch steps, each one groaning under his boots, and stopped in front of her with his hands on his hips. She had to tip her head back to meet his eyes, the top of her head barely clearing his belt buckle. "You're too small for this country." He said it without malice, the same way he would have told a man that his horse was lame. The frontier didn't care about refinement or silk or the careful way she held herself. It cared about whether you could haul water and mend fence and shoot straight. And he was looking at a woman who weighed less than his saddle. Haruko didn't flinch. She didn't look away or drop her gaze or do any of the things he had seen women do when they were frightened. She stood in the dust of the yard, in her plum-colored kimono, and looked at him with the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome. "Try me anyway." 3 words, spoken so quietly that the wind nearly took them. She said it the way someone states the weather, as a fact she intended to live inside. Then she picked up her case and walked past him toward the house. And he stood there in the yard, with his hands still on his hips and his mouth slightly open, because no woman had ever walked past him like he was furniture. Nash didn't see Tucker's glance. He was still watching the small figure disappear through his front door, the plum-colored silk the last thing visible before the door swung shut. He hadn't expected that. Nash came inside and stood in the doorway, filling it shoulder to shoulder. He watched her move through the house, checking the stove, touching the mantel, finding things without asking. She was already working, already moving through the space as if it were hers, and he hadn't given her permission to do any of it. The uncomfortable recognition of that settled in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow. The first week passed without conversation. Nash rose before dawn and rode out to check the fence lines, and Haruko rose at the same hour and began working the kitchen. When he came back at noon, there was food on the table. When he came back at dark, the house was clean and the lamp was lit. She placed the food on the table and went about her business, and he ate it alone because neither of them had figured out how to share a meal yet. The food was strange: rice and dried fish and a dark sauce that smelled of the sea, things from her case, and a parcel Tucker had brought from San Francisco. Nash ate it because it was hot and his body needed fuel, and the food was good, better than the salt pork and beans he had been living on for 6 years. The surprise of that settled somewhere behind his ribs and stayed there. He watched her work through the windows. She moved through the ranch with an efficiency that left nothing wasted, starting a garden behind the kitchen on the second day, hauling water from the well without straining, using her hips the way someone who had carried heavy things before would do. She didn't struggle, didn't pause to rest, didn't hesitate or falter the way he had expected a woman her size to do when faced with physical labor. On the fourth day, Nash cut his hand on a fence rail. The gash was deep, across the base of his thumb, and the blood ran down his wrist and dripped into the dirt. He wrapped it in his bandana and kept working, because that was what you did. But by evening the hand had swollen, and the skin around the cut had gone an angry red. Haruko saw it when he came inside. She didn't ask permission. She took his hand in both of hers and turned it over, and her fingers were cool against the hot skin. Then she crossed the room to her case and brought back a small lacquered box, dark wood with brass hinges, and opened it on the table. Inside the box were needles so fine they caught the kerosene lamplight like silver threads, and small paper packets of dried herbs, and a round stone pestle. She selected 3 needles and set them against the skin of his hand and wrist with a precision born of years of practice. The needles went in, and the pain did something strange. It didn't disappear, but it shifted, moving from a sharp scream to a dull hum, and the swelling began to ease within minutes. Her expression was the same one she wore when she cooked or hauled water, calm and practiced and not guessing at anything. She ground herbs into a paste, spread it across the cut, and wrapped his hand in clean linen. The whole process took less than 20 minutes, and when she was done, the throbbing had gone from a roar to a whisper. He hadn't expected that either. "What is that?" he asked, nodding toward the lacquered box. She closed the box and ran her fingers over the lid, the way someone touches something they have inherited rather than bought. She told him it was Kampo, the medicine her grandmother had taught her in Kyoto before she was born, and that the needles were for adjusting what the body couldn't fix on its own. She didn't explain further. She put the box away and began clearing the table, and the conversation was over, because she had decided it was over. On the 6th day, the ranch hands came in for the evening meal, 3 dusty men who slept in the bunkhouse and ate whatever Nash put in front of them. They filed into the kitchen and stopped when they saw Haruko standing at the stove in her kimono, and the silence that followed was the kind that made the air thick. The youngest hand, Jed, who had never been farther west than Kansas City, opened his mouth first. He said something about the China woman cooking dinner, and the words landed on the room like a stone dropped in still water. Nash set down his coffee cup. The sound was small, but it cut through the room the way a gunshot cuts through a morning. Not loud, but final. He looked at Jed with an expression that wasn't anger, but something heavier, the kind of look that reminded a man of the size of the person giving it. "She's Japanese," Nash said, "not Chinese. And she's cooking dinner in my house, and you'll eat it or you'll ride out tonight." Jed sat down and ate the food without speaking again for the rest of the meal. The other 2 hands followed his lead, and the kitchen fell silent except for forks on plates and the wind against the shutters. Haruko didn't acknowledge any of it. She served the food, cleared the plates, and washed the dishes in the basin while the men sat in the other room. But later that night, when Nash passed the kitchen on his way to bed, he saw her standing at the window with her hands still in the wash water, looking out at the dark, and for the first time since she had arrived, her shoulders weren't straight. Nash rode into Red Fork on a Tuesday for supplies. The town sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridges, 3 saloons and a general store, and a sheriff's office with a wooden star nailed to the door. The kind of town that existed because someone had been too tired to go any further. He tied his horse at the general store and went inside. The store was run by a man named Phelps, thick around the middle and slow of speech. Nash loaded coffee and salt and flour and ammunition, and Phelps tallied the bill on a scrap of paper behind the counter. It was Phelps who told him about the gang. He leaned over the counter and lowered his voice the way men did when they were about to say something they wished they didn't have to say. A group riding under a man named Clint had been hitting ranches across the Northern Territory, running off cattle and burning out anyone who resisted. 3 spreads in 2 weeks. The Dawson place, the McKenna place, and a small homestead north of the river whose name Phelps couldn't remember because the people who had lived there had left in the night and not come back. Nash listened without expression. He asked how many men, and Phelps said 8, maybe 10, armed and mean and not in a hurry. He asked about the sheriff, and Phelps made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. The sheriff had a warrant and a deputy and a horse, and the gang had 8 guns and no interest in warrants. The math, as Phelps told it, wasn't complicated. Nash loaded the supplies on the buckboard and drove to the saloon for a drink. The news sat heavy. The saloon was dim inside, kerosene lamps throwing amber light across the bar and the card tables. He ordered a whiskey and stood with his back to the wall, and the room rearranged itself around him the way rooms always did, because a man his size changed the geometry of any space he entered. A man at the bar, a rancher named Hank who ran a small spread south of town, leaned over and said something about Nash's Japanese bride. The words weren't cruel exactly, but they carried the weight of amusement, the kind a man uses when he thinks someone has made a foolish choice and wants to see if they know it. He asked if she could cook, and he asked if she could ride, and the way he asked made it clear he didn't expect the answer to be yes. Nash didn't explain or defend. He finished his whiskey, set the glass on the bar, and left. The buckboard rolled out of town in the late afternoon, and Nash drove with both hands on the reins and his jaw set like stone. He had 2 problems now, and neither one was small. The gang was coming south, and the town had already decided what Haruko was, a curiosity, a foreign woman on a frontier ranch, decided with the quiet certainty of people who have never seen anything they didn't understand. He drove the buckboard through the gate as the sun went down, and the ranch house was lit from inside, the kerosene glow warm against the darkening sky. Haruko was on the porch, sitting in the chair he had built too large for anyone but himself, her feet not touching the floor. She looked at him as he climbed down from the buckboard, and something in her expression told him she already knew something was wrong, the way animals know before a storm. He told her that night, sitting across the table from her after the dishes were cleared. He didn't soften it, or build up to it, or give her time to prepare. He said there was a gang in the territory, 8 armed men, and they were burning out ranches and running off cattle, and they were moving south. He said he expected them within the week. Then he told her he was sending her to town in the morning on the buckboard. She could stay at the boarding house in Red Fork until the trouble passed. His tone was final, the tone of a man who had never had to negotiate with anyone because no one had ever been in a position to refuse him. Haruko listened to all of it without moving. Her hands rested on the table, one on each side of her teacup, and her dark eyes didn't leave his face. When he finished, the silence between them wasn't the comfortable silence of the past week. It was the silence of a wall going up. "No," she said. The word sat on the table between them. Nash blinked, not accustomed to hearing that word directed at him, and the sound of it from someone her size, someone he could pick up with one arm, had a quality that he couldn't quite process. He tried again. He explained the danger more carefully, the way he would explain it to a hand who didn't understand what a gun did. 8 armed men, violence, the kind of trouble that got people killed. He told her he was too big for most men, and she was too small for any of them. He meant it as plain fact, the way he understood the world. Size determined survival out here, and the math was the same as it always was. Haruko picked up her teacup and drank from it, and set it down and folded her hands. She told him she hadn't crossed an ocean to be sent away when the trouble came. She said she had faced danger before. Her voice was quiet, the same volume she used for everything, and the steadiness of it was more unsettling than any amount of shouting would have been. He didn't know what to do with a woman who wouldn't be frightened into leaving. He had spent his whole life moving people with size and plain speech, and here was someone who didn't move. He pushed back from the table and walked to the porch, and the night air was cold and clean and did nothing to settle the thing turning in his chest. She came out a few minutes later. She didn't speak. She carried something in her arms, a long cloth bundle, and she set it on the porch rail and unwrapped it under the amber lamp that hung from the eave. Inside the cloth was a weapon he had never seen. A long wooden shaft, nearly 2 meters, with a curved blade at the end that caught the amber light and held it. The blade was single-edged and shaped like a sword that had been mounted on a pole, and the shaft was dark with age and use, the wood worn smooth by hands that had held it over generations. Haruko picked it up, and the way she held it told him everything her words hadn't. Her grip was automatic, her stance certain, the blade angled across her body in a guard position that spoke of muscle memory trained deeper than thought. She held it the way a fiddler holds a bow, the way a smith holds a hammer, the way someone holds a thing they have used since before they could name it. "What is that?" he asked. She told him it was a naginata, a weapon of her family, and that her grandmother had taught her to use it before she could read. She told him the women of her family had been trained to defend the household for generations, samurai women who stood at the gates when the men were gone. She didn't say it to impress him or to threaten him. She said it the way she said everything, as a fact about the world she had come from. Nash looked at the naginata, then at her, then at the naginata again. A pole arm against revolvers. He had seen too much frontier violence to put much stock in tradition or training that didn't come from a gun. But he couldn't stop watching her hands on the shaft, the familiarity of the grip, the way the blade moved like it was part of her arm and not something she was holding. He didn't take it from her or tell her to put it away. He stood on the porch with his arms crossed and said nothing, and the naginata rested against the wall inside the door. But it was the first thing he saw when he opened his eyes the next morning, leaning against the door frame where she had placed it, the blade catching the first gray light of dawn. 2 days later, the ranch hands rode out at noon. Nash had sent them to Red Fork with instructions to find the sheriff and bring him back if they could ride fast enough, and if the sheriff was willing, which Nash doubted, but had to try. The house was quiet after they left, the kind of quiet that comes when the world has been reduced to 2 people and the land between them and whatever is coming. Nash spent the afternoon preparing, loading his rifle and revolver, checking the fence line from horseback, moving the horses to the corral near the house. He barred the shutters on the north side and left the south windows open. He did these things with the practiced economy of a man who had thought about trouble before, and the fact that he was thinking about it this hard told him something he wasn't ready to admit. Evening came. The sky went from gold to copper to dark, and the kerosene lamps were lit, and the house was warm with the fire Haruko had built in the hearth. Nash sat on the porch cleaning his rifle, the bore rod moving through the barrel with an oiled rag, and the motion of his hands was the only part of him that was calm. Haruko came out and sat beside him. She brought him tea, something she had made from dried leaves in her supplies, and the cup was warm in his hand, and the taste was bitter and green and unlike anything he had drunk before. He drank it without comment, the way he accepted everything she did, and the silence between them had shifted from the awkward silence of strangers to something that wasn't quite companionship, but was no longer wariness. She spoke first. Her family had been samurai, she said, a warrior class that had served lords for hundreds of years, and the women of her family had carried the naginata for generations, standing guard at the household gates when the men rode to war. Her grandmother had started her on the forms before she was old enough to hold the full-length weapon, starting her with a shortened practice shaft and moving to the real blade when her arms were strong enough. She told him this the way someone tells another person where they're from, without nostalgia or performance, as geography rather than autobiography. He asked why she had left. She was quiet for a moment, and the firelight from the window played across her face and made her expression hard to read. Then she told him that the old ways were ending, that her family was gone, and that a correspondence arrangement in a country she had never seen had seemed less like exile and more like a door she could walk through. She didn't romanticize it. She stated the facts and let them sit. But there was something in the way she held the naginata across her knees that told him this weapon was the last piece of the world she had come from, and that she had carried it across an ocean the way some people carry a Bible, not as a tool, but as the last proof of who she was. Nash looked at the horizon. The stars were out and the range was dark and still. He thought about the ranch hands and how far they had to ride, and the math wasn't good. Red Fork was a half-day's ride, but the sheriff was one man with one deputy and no particular interest in dying for someone else's cattle. Even if the hands reached town by dark, the sheriff might not ride until morning, and morning might be too late. For the first time, Nash felt fear. Not for himself, because fear of a fight was something he'd never carried. The fear was for the woman sitting beside him on the porch, the one he had tried to send away, the one whose tea he was drinking from a cup she had placed in his hand without being asked. He had something to lose now, and the weight of that was heavier than anything he had ever carried. He told her he didn't want her to fight. His voice was rough, the words coming out like stones dragged from a riverbed, because saying things that mattered wasn't something he had practiced at. Haruko looked at the horizon the way she looked at everything, with the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted what is coming. She told him she knew, but she didn't put the naginata down, and he didn't ask her to. And they sat on the porch in the dark and waited for the dawn. Dawn came gray and cold. Nash was on the porch before the sun, rifle across his knees, coffee untouched on the rail beside him. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the air had the bite that comes with elevation, and the range was so still he could hear the creek a quarter-mile away. He saw the dust first, a smudge on the northern road, dark against the pale sky, moving south. He counted the shapes as they came into focus and stopped counting at 8. Riders, spread loose across the road, not hurrying, because men who have burned out 3 ranches without consequence don't need to hurry. Nash lifted the rifle and put a round in the chamber. The sound was small and mechanical and final. The gang reined up at the ranch gate, 50 yards from the house. 8 men on dusty horses, armed with revolvers and rifles, their clothes stained with trail dirt and weeks of campfire smoke. The man in front wasn't the biggest, but he sat his horse with the loose confidence of someone who has never been refused and doesn't expect to be. Clint, the one Phelps had named, a man with a narrow face and pale eyes and a way of looking at things that made you understand why people moved out of his path. He rode forward alone, stopping at the edge of the yard, and called out to Nash on the porch. His voice carried the way voices carry on open range, flat and clear and without effort. He said he wanted the cattle, all of them, and he wanted Nash to step aside and let him take them. He mentioned the other ranches, the ones that had burned, the ones whose owners had run. He said it plainly, the way a man says something he has said before and expects to hear yes to, because he has always heard yes before. Nash didn't step aside. He stood up from the chair and for a moment his size alone did what it had always done. 6'7", shoulders like a barn door, hands that could palm a rifle stock. Some of Clint's men exchanged glances, and one of them shifted in his saddle. But Clint had numbers, and numbers were the thing that won on the frontier, and they both knew it. The first shot came from Clint's left flank. Nash dove off the porch and rolled behind the water trough, and the bullet hit the rail where his head had been and sent a spray of splinters into the air. He came up firing, and his first shot took the man on the left flank in the shoulder, spinning him out of the saddle. His third caught a horse in the leg, and the animal went down screaming. But 8 against 1 wasn't a fight. It was a countdown. The outlaws spread out, flanking the trough, using the corral fence and the buckboard for cover. Nash fired until the rifle was empty, then drew the revolver. He hit another man, a graze across the hip, but the return fire was constant and close, and the trough was starting to splinter apart. A bullet caught him in the ribs. Not dead center, not fatal, but the kind of hit that drops a man because the body doesn't care about intentions. Nash went to one knee behind the trough, blood soaking through his shirt, the revolver heavy in his hand. The world narrowed to the sound of his own breathing and the dust in the air and the shapes of men moving closer from 3 sides. Clint called out from behind the buckboard. He said Nash had until the count of 10 to hand over the cattle, or they would burn the house with whoever was inside it. His voice was calm and conversational, the voice of a man who has made this threat before and watched it work. Nash's vision was going gray at the edges, the blood from his ribs pooling in the dirt beneath him. He thought about Haruko inside the house, and the fear that came with that thought was worse than the bullet. He had tried to send her away. She had refused. And now the thing he had been afraid of was here, and he couldn't stop it. And his size meant nothing against 8 guns and a countdown. Clint reached 5. The door of the ranch house opens. The sound is small, just the creak of cottonwood hinges, but it cuts through the gunfire and the counting and the dust like a blade through silk. Haruko steps onto the porch. She's in her kimono, the plum-colored silk she arrived in, jet black hair pinned in the traditional knot. The naginata is in both hands, the curved blade catching the morning light, the shaft resting against her shoulder. She's small against the wide porch, small against the Wyoming sky, small against 8 armed men who look at her with expressions that range from confusion to amusement. Clint stops counting. He looks at her from behind the buckboard, and whatever he sees in her face makes him pause for 1 second before he calls out that she should go back inside before she gets hurt. His voice is still calm, still conversational, but there's something new in it. The faintest trace of a man who has encountered something he didn't expect. Haruko doesn't go back inside. She steps off the porch, and the naginata sweeps down from her shoulder into a low guard position, the blade angled across her body, and her feet settle into a stance that's older than anything on this continent. The morning light runs along the curved edge of the blade like water along a gutter. The first man to reach for her is the one nearest the porch, a stocky man with a revolver in his right hand. He lunges forward to grab her arm, and the naginata moves in a low arc, almost too fast to follow. The blade catches his wrist, and the revolver falls into the dirt, and the man stumbles backward with his hand open to the bone. The sound he makes isn't a scream, but a gasp, the sound of someone whose body has understood what happened before his mind catches up. The reach of the pole arm is the thing. Nearly 2 meters from her grip to the blade's edge, which means she hits them before they can hit her. She's inside no one's reach and outside everyone's comfort. And the men who have spent their lives fighting at arm's length with revolvers and fists don't know what to do with a weapon that owns the space between them and her. 2 men fire at her. The shots go wide because she's already moving, already shifting to the left, the naginata sweeping in a horizontal arc that catches the second man across the chest and folds him sideways into the dirt. The third man tries to circle behind her, and the blade reverses direction without warning, the shaft swinging in her grip like a compass needle finding north, and the butt end catches him in the jaw and drops him where he stands. She doesn't rage. She doesn't scream or grunt or perform any of the sounds that men make when they fight. She moves through the outlaws the way she moves through the kitchen, with quiet, practiced efficiency, every motion serving a purpose, every step putting her where the next movement needs to begin. The naginata slashes and sweeps and thrusts, and men fall, and the dust in the yard is dark with blood and boot prints. Clint charges her with a knife. He's fast and he's angry, and the knife is in his hand before she can reset her guard, and for one moment the distance between them closes to nothing. The naginata catches him across the chest in a sweeping cut that starts low and rises, and the blade opens his shirt and the skin beneath it, and he folds backward like a door swinging on a broken hinge. He hits the ground with his knees drawn up and his hands pressed against his chest, and the knife in the dirt beside him. The remaining men break. 2 of them are already running for their horses, and a third is dragging himself toward the corral fence with one arm hanging wrong. The yard is quiet except for the sound of horses and the wind and the groaning of the men on the ground. Haruko stands in the center of the yard, the naginata resting against her shoulder, the blade dark with blood. She isn't breathing hard. Her kimono is spotted with dust but untouched, and her hair is still pinned in its knot, and her face wears the same expression it has worn since the day she arrived, the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst and found it survivable. Nash watches from the ground behind the water trough, his shirt soaked with blood. He has spent his entire life believing that size and strength and a steady aim were the only things that kept a person alive in this country. The woman he tried to send away on a buckboard has just scattered 8 armed men with a blade on a stick, and she's standing in the morning light, looking at the horizon as if nothing has changed. She looks at him. She doesn't say she told him so. She walks to where he kneels in the dirt, sets the naginata against the trough, and opens the lacquered medicine box she has carried outside. She kneels beside him and begins treating the wound in his ribs with the same calm hands that just ended the fight, and the needles go in, and the herbs go on, and the bleeding stops. Nash cannot close his mouth because everything he thought he knew about who belonged on the frontier has just been proven wrong by a woman who weighs less than his saddle. The sheriff arrived a day late, riding in with the ranch hands and a deputy who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. They found Clint and what was left of his gang tied to the corral rails, bandaged and defeated, sitting in the dust with the glazed expressions of men who had seen something they couldn't explain. They found Nash on the porch, with his ribs wrapped in clean linen, drinking tea. They found Haruko in the kitchen, washing dishes. The sheriff asked Nash what happened. Nash looked at Haruko through the open window, then told the sheriff there had been a disagreement, and it was settled. The sheriff looked at the 8 men tied to the corral, looked at the wound in Nash's ribs, looked at the small Japanese woman at the sink, and decided the details weren't something he needed to pursue. He loaded the outlaws on a buckboard and rode them back to Red Fork, and the warrant was served. Word traveled the way word always travels in a territory where nothing happens and everything gets repeated. Within a week, the story had grown in the telling, taking on the quality of a legend that nobody quite believed, but nobody could disprove. 8 armed men carried out on buckboards, and the woman who put them there bought her rice and her dried fish at Phelps's store every Thursday without anyone daring to trouble her. The change in Red Fork wasn't dramatic. Nobody apologized or made speeches. The change was in the way people moved, the small adjustments a town makes when the hierarchy of who matters has shifted without anyone voting on it. The men at the saloon who had laughed about Nash's mail-order bride went quiet when she passed. Phelps set aside the rice she preferred without being asked. Jed, the young hand who had called her the China woman, said good morning to her one Thursday outside the store, the words coming out stiff and careful. Haruko nodded back without acknowledging that anything had changed. She bought her rice and dried fish and rode home on the buckboard the way she did every Thursday, alone, the naginata wrapped in cloth on the seat beside her. Nash was quieter in the weeks that followed, not humbled, but turning something true over in his mind. He didn't tell Haruko she was too small for this country anymore, but he built her a room on the south side of the house, with a window that faced east toward the rising sun, a shelf for the lacquered medicine box, and a bracket on the wall for the naginata. He didn't explain why he built it, and she didn't ask, and the room was there when she came in from the garden one evening and found it finished, the kerosene lamp already lit. Weeks passed, the garden grew, and the cattle fattened on the fall grass. The ranch settled into a rhythm that had room for 2 people in it, and the silence between Nash and Haruko was no longer the silence of strangers, but the silence of 2 people who have seen what the other is made of and don't need to talk about it. One evening, Nash sat on the porch with his coffee, watching the sun go down behind the Wyoming hills. Haruko came out and sat beside him, bringing tea, and the naginata rested inside the door on its bracket, within reach but not displayed. The rifle leaned against the rail where Nash always kept it. 2 weapons, 2 people, 2 kinds of strength the frontier didn't know it needed. Nash spoke first. He said he had been wrong about her. The words came out plain, without decoration or apology, the way he said everything, and the cost of them showed in how long it took him to get them out. Haruko didn't argue or agree or nod. She drank her tea and looked at the hills. Then she said something so quiet he had to lean down to hear her, the same way he had leaned down on the first day. She said she had been wrong about him, too. She didn't explain what she meant, and he didn't ask, and the silence that followed wasn't empty, but full. The kind of silence that happens when 2 people have stopped needing to fill the air with things they don't mean. The sun went down. The hills turned purple, then black, and the stars came out, and the kerosene lamp in the window threw warm light across the porch where the giant and the small woman sat together, not speaking, not needing to. The ranch quiet around them, and the range stretching out in every direction toward the edge of the known world. She had come from a country that was ending, carrying a weapon older than the one he kept by his door. He had built a life with his hands and his size and nothing else, and she had shown him that the world was wider than his grip on it. Not love, not even trust, but a recognition. 2 people who had both learned what it meant to stand alone against something stronger than themselves, sitting on a porch in Wyoming, watching the dark come down. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels.